The title of our upcoming concert is Experience, the Teacher of All Things. And that is from a quote by Julius Caesar, an actual extant quote. And it seemed an appropriate title for a concert where we're going to be looking at four works which in some ways sum up a lot of what their composers had to say. I've always been fascinated by late or last works by artists in all fields. Some of the late canvases of Paul Klee, which seem so horrific and anguished. That bitter novella by Mark Twain called The Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg, which essentially bids a very jaundiced, acerbic farewell to mankind on Mark Twain's part. And so I thought it would be an interesting exercise to put together a concert of four late, if not last works by four great composers to see how they summed up a lot of their musical thinking. We're going to begin with one of the most famous unfinished works in the repertoire, The Art of Fugue by Johann Sebastian Bach. And this is a work which in some ways existed in his mind rather than, I think, as something that he intended to be performed. I say that because there is no indication in his manuscript of any instruments or any voices. It's as if he wrote these lines and said, you know, if you're reading this or if you're performing it, so long as you're taking these notes into account, you are getting my meaning. But he didn't say whether it was an orchestral piece, a string quartet, an organ work. And so anytime you hear a performance of any part of Art of Fugue, what you're listening to is somebody's take on it, somebody who took the notes and decided it should be performed in this instance by combination X, combination Y, combination Z. In this case, we're going to do one of the most famous excerpts from it, the Contrapunctus number 9. I made my own orchestration of this magnificent fugue for winds, brass, harp, and percussion. So not your usual performing forces for a work by Bach, but we'll just have to see if it works. Copland's sound, that inimitable American sound that was as natural to him as breathing, was obvious in works that were rowdy, or quiet and reflective. Another important side of Copland's very, very self-consciously American music would be some of the jazzy works that he wrote between about 1925 and the early 1930s. Prominent among these was Music for the Theater, which is about as raunchy and rowdy a piece as he or anybody else ever wrote. But lesser known are some of the more experimental works, some of the early, very, very dissonant, very angular works. And later in his life, when he, as he once said, needed new chords, he had a couple of tries at using Arnold Schoenberg's 12-tone system. I readily admit I'm not a fan of Schoenberg's music, but I certainly do enjoy the way that other composers have used Schoenberg's 12-tone method. And Copland's 12-tone works, there are about 3 or 4 of them, all of them fall quite naturally on my ear. I think it's because even though he used that method, there is still that Copland sound. There is still that what people frequently describe as that wide open spaces sound, except that instead of these wide-ranging melodies made up of open intervals, such as the melody that opens Billy the Kid. We have melodies and accompaniments made up of 12-tone rows, the same wide open space sense, but with a different harmonic language. Now, to my ear, that's a very beautiful thing, and I'm hoping that even though there may be a few raised eyebrows from people who are expecting another rodeo, another Appalachian Spring, another Billy the Kid, that enough of that beloved Copland sound will be found in this work called Inscape, so that while it may seem like an unfamiliar side of Copland, enough of the old Copland will be wedded to it, and that people will have a rewarding listening experience. Interesting thing about the very opening of the piece, there are 12 tones in our Western chromatic scale, and then it starts over again. And Copland very broadly expresses a strength at the outset of the piece by having this big explosive chord spoken several times by different instrumental combinations. I can't play the whole chord at once because I only have 5 fingers on each hand, but the entire chord comes out something like this. And after it dies down, a solo oboe comes in, and then ensues a very quiet dialogue between some of the woodwinds. And I don't know how to explain this any better than this. When I started to get to know this piece, there was something unusually touching about the entrance of the oboe after the orchestra had been screaming out this big, bold chord, and to suddenly have, and it's much more effective, of course, in its orchestral guise. And when I finally really studied the piece, when I went from being merely a listener to an executant, I, of course, started looking at it from a more analytical point of view and discovered that this opening chord is 11 of the 12 tones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And after expressing this chord several times, when the oboe comes in on a C sharp, that's the missing 12th tone. And it's almost as if, you know, in completing that, Copland does something incredibly expressive that I don't know of any other composer using the 12-tone method who's ever done anything quite that touching. And the whole work, it's only about a 12 or 13-minute work, is genuinely expressive and moving. Your grandmother's Copland? No. But well worth hearing, well worth getting to know. I believe Copland's publisher has informed us that this is going to be its Northwest premiere. And finally, as to the title, I just want to read something from the foreword of the score. The title of the work is borrowed from the 19th century English poet-priest Gerard Manley Hopkins. The word inscape was invented by Hopkins, according to his editor W.H. Gardner, to suggest a, quote, quasi-mystical illumination, a sudden perception of that deeper pattern, order, and unity, which gives meaning to external forms. The first half of this concert is going to conclude with work by Mozart that I'm frankly surprised is not better known. The cynical side of me, to the extent that there is one, wonders if perhaps it has been suppressed because it would tend to take away a sort of a beloved illusion of what people want to think. You know, we sometimes like to imagine a poor, suffering artist going out in either a very depressed or a very, what is that overused word, autumnal, resigned style. And there are several works that people love to play by Mozart, several of his late works, which they feel indicate that he knew that he was dying, that, you know, he was expressing his poverty, the fact that he just could not seem to get a foothold in having a successful career and living comfortably. And so they usually think of works like the last of the 27 piano concertos, the second movement of which goes. Or a work like the Clarinet Concerto, which even in its fast movement seems to have this sort of wistful, teary-eyed aspect to it. Etc. And so here we have this lovely cantata that Mozart wrote to be performed at his Masonic lodge. This is, in fact, the last work that he finished, that he performed before he took to his sickbed. This was, in some ways, his musical last will and testament. This was his last statement as a composer-performer, this cantata for men's chorus and small orchestra that was performed probably to great success by members of his Masonic circle. And if you want to perpetuate this notion of Mozart sort of going away like this musically, you probably will not like this work, which is in some ways like a Beethoven's Ninth in microcosm, espousing unity and brotherly love. The music is very reminiscent of his opera, The Magic Flute, and is really a joyful whoop of exaltation. In the case of the Prokofiev Symphony No. 7, we have a piece with a very sad ending. Or do we? In some ways, it's up to the conductor to decide what effect the piece is going to have on the audience. It's a 4-movement symphony. He finished it the year before he died. And as you know, there were many, many Soviet artists, both in music and the other arts, who were constantly running afoul of Stalin and his cronies because they did not produce works which embodied the Soviet spirit, optimism, courage, valor. And if you dared to write something that was not felt to express these kinds of sentiments, you were in deep Russian doo-doo. And so Prokofiev wrote this piece in which it's almost as if he looks back on his life and suddenly the piece at the end takes this very wrong turn in the course of a very, very almost silly, almost superficial finale. Suddenly, the glockenspiel and the harp and the piano start this almost a ticking based on a major triad. And the orchestra has pulled back its speed and suddenly puts forth these almost pained gestures. It's almost as if Prokofiev literally felt his life essence ticking away, and the piece literally dies. It dies. I mean, it dies in the major, but it dies nonetheless. with one sad last pizzicato in the strings. That is how he originally wrote it, how he originally conceived it. But then some of his close friends, who both wanted to shield him from possible action on the part of Stalin and also wanted him to have a chance at winning a prize for this piece, because new Soviet works were frequently awarded cash prizes, they said, you know, this is not going to fly with the authorities. You'd better put on a more optimistic ending. So reluctantly, Prokofiev came up with about a 20 or 30 bar coda that suddenly goes back to the fast, skittish music of the opening of the last movement. And it duly ends with a big pa-da! But he told his friends, please, after I die, don't let them do that coda anymore. That said, many conductors do opt for the happy ending. And you certainly can't fault them. It's not as if somebody else wrote it. I mean, yes, it is Prokofiev. Yes, it is something that he wrote. But is it true to what he really wanted to express? I think not. And so, with all due respect to those of you who avoid the D word, we're going to let Prokofiev die this time around.